People have a lot of different visions of what the future is going to be with autonomous vehicles. And it kind of divides into two worlds. One group has a very utopian view. AVs will deliver all of these social and environmental benefits. But there's also a dystopian view. I'm David Malikoff. I'm a deputy news editor here at Science, and I edited our autonomous vehicles package. Our two reporters who looked at the phenomenon of autonomous vehicles realized that there are a lot of obstacles in the way to the full deployment of fully autonomous vehicles. So it turns out when you survey people, they actually have a lot of apprehension about getting into an AV. And so there's actually a lot of research now going on looking at how do people perceive AVs, not just the people who are inside them, but also the people who are outside them, around them. So for example, when an AV pulls up to a crosswalk, how will a pedestrian know that the car has seen them, right, and recognize them? How will the car communicate with the pedestrian what it's about to do? But also inside the car. So for example, researchers are experimenting with things like cars that talk to the passenger.
Detour detected. Updating route.
In order to reassure them and tell them what the car is about to do. Or video screens that show the passenger what the car is seeing. All the landmarks, the pedestrians, the other cars. So one of the interesting debates among people who study autonomous vehicles is how safe do the cars actually have to get before consumers will be persuaded to use them, and that they're worth putting out on the road in terms of saving lives. So on one side are people who say, boy, you know, consumers are never going to really trust these cars until they are perfectly safe, which is a little odd, right? Because right now, we accept a pretty high level of risk when we get into our cars, right? People are unwilling to get into an AV that might be just as safe as current cars that are on the road because, you know, they have a sense that they don't have control. There's another group of scholars who have a slightly different view. They say, look, we should get some minimum increment in the increase in safety, say 3% or 5% or 10%, and just start putting those cars on the road. Get them learning how to become better, and then over time you'll get safer and safer cars. So ownership is an interesting question. A lot of companies that are building AVs are imagining a future where they are selling to fleets. So imagine Uber or Lyft or taxi cab companies where the entire fleet are automated vehicles. In the dystopian view, there's also an equity concern, which is that some people will have access to this technology and other people won't. So for example, people living in cities which have well-built infrastructure might have easy access to AVs, but people who live in rural areas where the infrastructure is not so good might not have such easy access. One of the big unknowns is, how are people going to actually use these cars? And it turns out there's surprisingly little research on this. But there are some studies going on. One was quite clever. To mimic behavior of using an AV, a researcher agreed to give a number of families in California access to a chauffeur-driven car for a week that would show up whenever they wanted and do whatever they wanted it to do. And then she compared the use of the chauffeur-driven car to how they drove the week before they had the chauffeur-driven car and the week after they had the chauffeur-driven car. What she found was they actually took many more trips, traveled many more miles. So that feeds into this idea that AVs may not necessarily reduce car use, they could increase car use. I think the bottom line of our two stories is that amidst all this hype surrounding autonomous vehicles, people need to step back, take a deep breath, and realize things may not happen quite as quickly as they seem, and that they should really be a little skeptical about all of the claims that are being made about AVs. Maybe the hype has outrun the reality, and eventually there's going to be a balancing out.